This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lord Kitchener by G.K. Chesterton. Section 3. Something of the same shadow of prophecy is perhaps the deepest memory left by the last war of Kitchener before the greatest. After further activities in Egypt and the Sudan, of which the attempt to educate the Fellaheen by the Gordon Memorial College was the most remarkable, he was abruptly summoned to South Africa to be the right hand of Lord Roberts in the war then being waged against the Boers. He conducted the opening of the determining battle of Paardeberg, and was typically systematic in covering the half-conquered country with a system of blockhouses and enclosures, like a diagram of geometry. But today, and for many reasons, Englishmen will think first of the last scene of that war, when Botha and the Boer generals surrendered to Kitchener. There was the same goodwill among the soldiers, to contrast with the ill will of the journalists. Botha also became almost a friend, and Botha also was to be in the far future an ally, smiting the German in Africa as Kitchener smote him in Europe. There was the same hint of prophecy about the war that ended at Vereeniging as about that other war that so nearly began at Fashoda. It seemed almost as if God were pitting his heroes against each other in a tournament before they all rode together against the heathen pouring out upon them out of Germany. It is with that name of Germany that this mere skeleton of the facts must end. After the South African War, Kitchener had been made Commander-in-Chief in India, where he effected several vital changes, notably the emancipation of that office from the veto of the military member of the Council of the Viceroy, and where he showed once more in his dealings with the sepoys that obscure yet powerful sympathy with the mysterious intellect of the East. Thence he had been again shifted to Egypt, but the next summons that came to him swallowed up all these things. A short time after war broke out with Germany, he was made Minister of War, and held that post until the dark season when he set out on a mission to Russia, which never reached its goal. But when his ship went down, he had already done a work and registered a change in England, with some words about which this sketch may well conclude. Journalistic attacks were indeed made upon him, but in writing for a foreign reader, I pass them by. In such a place I will not say even of the meanest of the Englishmen what they were not ashamed to say of the greatest. In his new work he was not only a very great man, but one dealing with very great things, and perhaps his most historic moment was when he broke his customary silence about the deeper emotions of life, and became the mouthpiece of the national horror at the German fashion of fighting, which he declared to have left a stain upon the whole profession of arms. For by a movement unusually and unconsciously dramatic, he chose that moment to salute across the long stretch of years the comparative chivalry and nobility of his dead enemies of the Sudan, and to announce that in the heart of Europe, in learned academies and ordered government offices, there had appeared a lunacy so cruel and unclean that the maddest dervish dead in the desert had a right to disdain it where he lay. Kitchener, like other Englishmen of his type, made his name outside England and even outside Europe. But it was in England, and after his return to England, that he did what will perhaps make his name most permanent in history. That return to England was indeed as symbolic as his last and tragic journey to Russia. Both will stand as symbols of the deepest things which are moving mankind in the Great War. In truth, the whole of that great European movement, which we called the cause of the Allies, is in itself a homeward journey. It is a return to native and historic ideals after an exile in the howling wilderness of the political pessimism and cynicism of Prussia. After his greatest adventures in Africa and Asia, the Englishman has rediscovered Europe, and in the very act of discovering Europe, the Englishman has at last discovered England. The revelation of the forces still really to be found in England itself when all is said that can possibly or plausibly be said against English commercialism and selfishness, was the last work of Lord Kitchener. He was the embodiment of an enormous experience which has passed through imperialism and reached patriotism. He had been the supreme figure of that strange and sprawling England which lies beyond England, which carries the habits of English clubs and hotels into the solitudes of the Nile or up the passes of the Himalayas, and is infinitely ignorant of things infinitely nearer home. For this type of Englishman, Cairo was nearer than Calais. Yet the typical figure which we associated with such places as Cairo was destined, before he died, to open again the ancient gate of Calais and lead in a new and noble fashion the return of England to Europe. The great change for which his countrymen will probably remember him longest was what we should call in England the revolution of the new armies. It is almost impossible to express how great a revolution it was so as to convey its dimensions to the citizens of any other great European country where military service has long been the rule and not the exception, where the people itself is only the army in mufti. In its mere aspect to the eye it was something like an invasion by a strange race. The English professional soldier of our youth had been conspicuous not only by his red coat but by his rarity. When rare things become common, they do not become commonplace. The memory of their singularity is still strong enough to give them rather the appearance of a prodigy, as anyone can realize by imagining an army of hunchbacks or a city of one-eyed men. The English soldier had indeed been respected as a patriotic symbol, but rather as a priest or a prince can be a symbol, as being the exception and not the rule. A child was taken to see the soldier outside Buckingham Palace, almost as he was taken to see the king driving out of Buckingham Palace. Hence the first effect of the enlargement of the armies was something almost like a fairy tale, almost as if the streets were crowded with kings walking about and wearing crowns of gold. This merely optical vision of the revolution was but the first impression of a reality equally vast and new. The first levies, which came to be called popularly Kitchener's Army because of the energy and inspiration with which he set himself to their organization, consisted entirely of volunteers. It was not till long after the whole face of England had been transformed by this mobilization that the government resorted to compulsion to bring in a mere margin of men. Save for the personality of Kitchener, the new militarism of England came wholly and freely from the English. While it was as universal as a tax, it was as spontaneous as a riot. But it is obvious that to produce so large and novel an effect out of the mere psychology of a nation, apart from its organization, was something which required tact as well as decision, and it is this which illustrated a side of the English general's character without which he may be, and indeed has been, wholly misunderstood. It is of the nature of national heroes of Kitchener's type that their admirers are unjust to them. They would have been better appreciated if they had been less praised. When a soldier is turned into an idol, there seems an unfortunate tendency to turn him into a wooden idol, like the wooden figure of Hindenburg erected by the ridiculous authorities of Berlin. In a more moderate and metaphorical sense, there has been an unfortunate tendency to represent Kitchener as strong by merely representing him as stiff, to suggest that he was made of wood and not of steel. There are two maxims which have been, I believe, the mottos of two English families, both of which are boasts, but each the contrary of the other. The first runs, "You can break me, but you cannot bend me," and the second, "You can bend me, but you cannot break me." With all respect to whoever may have borne it, the first is the boast of the barbarian, and therefore of the Prussian. The second is the boast of the Christian and the civilized man, that he is free and flexible, yet always returns to his true position like a tempered sword. Now, too much of the eulogy on a man like Kitchener tended to praise him not as a sword but as a poker. He happened to rise into his first fame at a time when much of the English press and governing class was still entirely duped by Germany, and to some extent judged everything by a Bismarckian test of blood and iron. It tended to neglect the very real disadvantages, even in practical life, which lie upon the man of blood and iron, as compared with the man of blood and bone. It is one grave disadvantage, for instance, that if a man made of iron were to break his bones, they would not heal. In other words, the Prussian Empire, with all its perfections and efficiencies, has one notable defect, that it is a dead thing. It does not draw its life from any primary human religion or poetry. It does not grow again from within. And being a dead thing, it suffers also from having no nerves to give warning or reaction. It reads no danger signals. It has no premonitions about its own spiritual doom. Its sentinels are deaf, and all its spies are blind. On the other hand, the British Empire, with all its blunders and bad anomalies, to which I am the last person to be blind, has one noticeable advantage, that it is a living thing. It is not that it makes no mistakes, but it knows it has made them, as the living hand knows when it has touched hot iron. That is exactly what a hand of iron would not know, and that is exactly the error in the German ideal of a hand of iron. No candid critic of England can read its history fairly and fail to see a certain flexibility and self-modification, illiberal policies followed by liberal ones, men failing in something and succeeding in something else, men sent to do one thing and being wise enough to do another, the human power of the living hand to draw back. As it happens, Kitchener was extraordinarily English in this lively and vital moderation, and it is to be feared that the more German idealization of him in the largely unenlightened England before the war has already done some harm to his reputation, and in missing what was particularly English has missed what was particularly interesting. Lord Kitchener was personally a somewhat silent man, and his social conventions were those of the ordinary English officer, especially the officer who has lived among Orientals, conventions which in any case tend in the direction of silence. He also really had, and to an extent of which some people complained, a certain English embarrassment about making all his purposes clear, especially before they were clear to himself. He probably liked to think a thing out in his own way, and therefore at his own time, which was not always the time at which people thought they had a right to question him. In his way it is true of him, as of such another strong man as the Irish patriot Parnell, that his very simplicity had an effect of secrecy. But it is a complete error about him, as it was a complete error about Parnell, to suppose that he took the Prussian pose of disdaining and disregarding everybody, that he settled everything in solitary egoism, that he was a superman, too self-sufficing to listen to friends, and too philosophical to listen to reason. It will be noted that every crisis of his life that is lit up by history contradicts the colours of this picture. He could not only take counsel with his friends, but was abnormally successful in taking counsel with his foes. It is notable that whenever he came in personal contact with the great captain, actually or potentially in arms against him, the result was not a mere collision, but a mutual comprehension. He established the friendliest relations with the chivalrous and adventurous Marchand, standing on the deadly debatable land of Fashoda. He established equally friendly relations with the Boer generals gathered under the dark cloud of national disappointment and defeat. In all such instances, so far as his individuality could count, it is clear that he acted as a moderate, and in the universal sense as a liberal. The results and the records of those who met him in such hours are quite sufficient to prove that he did not leave the impression of a Prussian arrogance. If he was silent, his silence must have been more friendly, I had almost said more convivial, than many men's conversation. But on the larger platform of the European war, this quiet but unique gift of open-mindedness and intellectual hospitality was destined to do two very decisive things which may profoundly affect history. In the first, he dealt with the more democratic and even revolutionary elements in England, and in the second he represents a very real change that has passed over the English traditions about Russia. The end of section 3.